So welcome to all you lords of the supplier jungle out there. I'm Danny Thompson from apexanalytix, and our featured guest for the next hour is supplier risk and payment fraud expert Joni Geurts from JetBlue. And the topic for the day, and really for the year it seems like, is supplier risk. How to identify it, mitigate it, how to prepare for whatever the world is going to throw at us next. And in addition to Joni and the information she's going to share, I can't wait to share with you a recent Gartner report around risk that provides a really great foundation for thinking about implementing or automating your supplier risk management program. So let's start with JetBlue. Joni, say hi and tell everyone a bit about JetBlue, the year you've had, and a bit of your risk story. Joni, you there? You might be on mute.
There we go. Let's try. It would not unmute. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm Joni Geurts, as Danny said, from JetBlue Airways. I have been at JetBlue for the past 20 years. I was started when I was 15 years old as a child prodigy, so we had that program, which is obviously no longer in effect. Anyway, JetBlue, we have this slide up. We're not quite back to 1,000 daily flights. We have a little change in that number of 22,000 as well due to this past year and the pandemic. We definitely did not fly 42 million customers. We are ramping back up right now. We're still with the other airlines at about 50%. People do want to travel. They want to get out there. They do feel safe. From a lot of the surveys we've been doing, they feel safe about flying. I think some of the requirements are maybe hindering everybody, but hopefully soon we'll get back to a normal atmosphere. Scaling back up across a lot of these organizations, and especially the airlines, we're seeing a number of remote employees. And with that is you have to have the tools that you can optimize the performance and get the results you need. And that's what we're going to be kind of talking about today. So this literally is a picture of me in a car. When I first started here in AP, this is exactly what I felt like. I did not have any visibility as to what was in our system. A lot of people felt like with our ERP, we had controls in place and that we would not have any duplicate payments or vendors, which is absolutely not true, as I came to find out. I just did not have any insight to what was in there and how many overpayments we had made. Our ERP, which is SAP, does not have any fraud tools in the system. So what we have done at JetBlue is we use Apex for several different things. So we use First Strike to manage our fraud, and so that we're able to see the risk in there with fraud, duplicate vendors, duplicate payments. Sorry, I think my internet is glitching here. Am I still on there?
Yeah, you're good, Joni.
Okay, sorry about that. Virtual meetings are awesome. So the other thing that we use is the portal for our business partners. We call them not vendors, our management of that, and around all of the compliance controls that we need. This has been huge over the past year just because of our setting and that we're remote and that we're not in the office, and how the fraud world has changed and what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and we'll get into some of those specifics. I know you've got a great fraud report, a fraud story that you are eager to tell everyone. So really just pulling in the information from this Gartner report that we're excited to share with everyone their market guide for supplier risk management solutions. They started by providing a definition of what supplier risk management is. And really, if you ask 5 people what supplier risk management is, you might get 10 different answers. And this is Gartner's definition. And really, if you read through the definition, you see that supplier risk management starts with tracking events and supplier attributes that impact the supplier's ability to fulfill orders. And really, to track a supplier's attributes, you have to go back a step. You have to make sure that you're capturing the supplier attributes and making sure they're accurate. Like, who's the beneficial owner of a supplier is really important. Are they prohibited? Do you have the necessary insurance? Do they have the necessary insurance documents? Are there IT controls in place? All of that data needs to be captured and confirmed at onboarding, and some level of continuous monitoring has to be in place. And of course, different suppliers pose different levels of risk, different sources of risk. So what you capture and monitor will vary based on the supplier segment and their own risk profile. So Joni, does this definition align with your definition of supplier risk management?
Yeah, absolutely. That's spot on, Danny. You hit, that's exactly what I would have said. A couple of components is the last couple of years is this corporate social responsibility, and suppliers need to match that with our standards. We have a lot of different programs that we do. We build playgrounds, we do reduce waste, and we have a huge recycling program. We're also doing some carbon footprint offsets after every single flight. So we have to be in sync with our business partners in that, and this helps us when they're registering. We can ask these questions, we can dig deeper to find out if this is really going to be a good match. We also have a lot of the diversity inclusion programs, from veterans to women-owned, the LGBTQ and Latino communities. It's kind of difficult not to have insight into that, what's in your system, and when you have something that can track this for you, and that if you have a specific goal in mind, this will be a tool that you can definitely use to help with all of those things. And I think too, just this past year, a lot of it's been this financial flexibility that during the pandemic. And like I said before, it's really not a secret that we've been hit hard, the airlines in general, and then also our suppliers. So when you think about them, all of a sudden they're contracted with all of these airlines to do groundwork, and there is no more groundwork. So being able to reach out to them and work together with them has been a huge, huge help. So, and hopefully we get past this soon.
Yeah, so there's the supply chain risk factor. There's a huge reputational risk factor that has to be managed as well. And another factor that is really important to risk monitoring is data accuracy. Do you really know who your supplier is? So whenever possible, third-party data sources can be pulled in to identify risks like credit scores, maybe OFAC checks for prohibited vendors, or to confirm data provided by a supplier. And I'll give you a real world example. Joni, question for you. When suppliers fill out the online form to register as a supplier in the JetBlue Apex portal, what do you think is the most common tax ID that they enter or they try to enter?
Yeah, the most common would be the 111111.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, everybody, they might have a little bit of reluctance to provide their tax ID, so they just lay down on the one. But if you're in in a company that's trying to understand who your supplier is, you need to know their real tax ID. And so that's one reason we built real-time integration to the IRS and to other global tax authorities to validate the tax ID and legal name combination, so that when a supplier registers, they're not allowed to register unless they give you their real legal name and their real entity type and the real tax ID. And so now that you know the supplier's legal name and tax ID, that means you can have more confidence in things like your OFAC check or credit risk scores or bank account ownership validations.
Exactly.
So Gartner kind of builds off of the definition that we talked about on the slide before, with really 6 areas of supplier risk factors. And like JetBlue's corporate responsibility focus, a lot of clients have been leveraging the control of the Apex portal for their CSR initiatives, really beyond OFAC checks and our other prohibited lists. We found many global companies have an internal list of vendors that they don't want to work with for performance or reputation reasons, but the company's got multiple divisions or subsidiaries that could easily slip through the onboarding for that supplier, onboarding that supplier again. So they need a single point of onboarding so that a prohibited supplier isn't onboarding in another division of the company. Or also to get the parent-child relationships of the suppliers right, so a prohibited supplier subsidiary doesn't get onboarded. And another aspect of managing these risks is with compliance questionnaires based on supplier segments. So IT vendors will have a different screening process and components in their onboarding process than, say, landscaping vendors. Yeah. And Joni, are you doing things around this? How are you qualifying suppliers and determining whether they're part of these programs?
Yeah, so we do have a key factor in our risk questionnaire is the spend. So we want to know how much are we projecting to spend with this supplier. And this helps us kind of focus on which ones will be a greater risk than many of those long tail suppliers. And, you know, if that changes down the road, if they start out with a projected, you know, $10,000 a year, but in the first 6 months, we see that it's going to be more like $500,000 or $1 million, we would want to reevaluate that and get more information to see if we're going to be safe with this supplier and what is our risk.
Yeah, so spend is part of your determination of whether a supplier needs, you know, true management of any risk factors that they present, because the more money you have going with them, the greater risk they present. What other kinds of factors are you using?
Well, I mean, and right now, like I said, we look at anything over 25,000.
Yeah.
And then if it's exceeded, we get an alert from our fraud module to say, hey, look, this has gone past that. You may want to go back. Again, having this insight into your system, what's in there, what you're doing, it's key, because you would never know if you're using an e-invoicing system, for example. I've had a lot of people say to me, well, this kind of mitigates the fraud because they're entering here, and if they enter again, we will know. Or if you may catch that, but if they add the -1 or the .a, anything like that, you won't, your e-invoicing system will see that as a different invoice. So you may not also have the ability to say, what is the total spend? I can get the total spend from a supplier in seconds in First Strike that shows me here's where they started 3 years ago and here's where they are today. So
Yeah.
again, controlling that risk is key.
Yeah, and spend's a factor. There are also factors like, is the supplier in a high risk location, or are they submitting high risk, high fraud risk commodities, as well as things like, are they interacting with your portal in off hours, or just any, there are lots of different sorts of flags that can indicate something suspicious is going on with a supplier.
Right, and you'd want to know, are you the only supplier? So they have consecutive invoices, 100, 101, 102, you're going to think, am I that their only customer? And that's a red flag. Bank changes, also very critical, that you'd want to, especially right now, you could call in, you can get information from several different people. They're not sitting next to each other, so they may call into our phone number and get one person and wait 10 minutes and call back and get somebody else to say, oh, here's this one piece of information. What else do I need? And then, they find their way into what they need in order to get a bank account changed.
Yeah, so we'll have some more details about some of these different risk categories in a minute. But I just wanted to take a second to provide some information. We were kind of curious at Apex, what was the state of supplier risk management? What companies had a solution in place and what didn't? And so we worked with SSON to conduct a survey that showed that over 60% of companies had a limited or no supplier risk management program in place. And I think, 2020 really kind of helped the market change, and now they're looking to implement something. Most companies are trying to get a hold of this if they didn't already have a control. And the reason for that, just a few reasons that we think about from an AP perspective, but there are also procurement impacts and supply chain impacts. But a few of these are really material impacts to the company's bottom line. And here are a few examples. Large companies are experiencing really massive amounts of fraud, fines. They're losing millions due to payment errors. And all of these bad outcomes are often baked in right from the start with poor controls in their vendor onboarding processes. And the OFAC example highlights a financial impact of what a violation could mean to your company. I mean, it's just companies get fined $650,000 and 20 years in prison over one potential incident, but the reputational risk associated with that can be even far greater than those fines. So, if that news gets out, you wouldn't want it to get out. Joni, fraud attempts have really skyrocketed over the past year, and I know you've got a fraud story that everybody would like to hear.
Yeah, and this is not like high tech, real sophisticated fraud here. It is kind of a smart fraud. It's a good way to try and hack into to a system. They get a list of who some of your suppliers are, and they do that through emails to people that they know or they have a name. They start sending to them, and then once they know, okay, you have, on this example, unique.com, they can create this fake email, and with that hyperlink, it's really UNIG, that you can't really see that. And this is obviously bigger than what you would see in an email. So when you get this to say, please update this account, it looks like it's coming from that supplier. These are two actual examples that we did get. We were able to catch these. I know some of the other airlines that I have talked to also received these emails. They did lose money. They were, they missed the Expedia group instead of group, but they have the right names. They had the right contacts to get this pushed through. This actually came from an internal crew member here at JetBlue saying, we've received the information, can you please update this account? And when it's coming from a trusted person with inside your company, you're thinking they validated and checked this. But that's exactly how they get in. So they know the way in, they get the name, they kind of, and in this particular case, they had hacked into somebody's true account that when they sent it to the JetBlue person, they had no idea it wasn't that person. So you really, there's just so many ways they can get in. And like I said, this is not high tech. I mean, this is changing a G and a Q. But the portal would have caught this and stopped it immediately.
Yeah, so this is a fraud risk. And actually, we had a webinar just a week or so ago with Wells Fargo. We've partnered with them around a bank account ownership validation that actually confirms the ownership of the bank account at the bank. That if you're interested in, you should just look at our website and you can access that video. There are, sometimes addressing risk is completely under your control as the buyer, but sometimes mitigation requires some supplier involvement, especially if they're like operational risks. And this chart is from the Gartner report, and it identifies tactics that companies are using to monitor for disruption threats. And it breaks mitigation tactics into three categories: program design, operations, and what they call offer, which is really just strategizing around your product mix. And the very top one is use disruptive events to refine playbooks and gain additional resource investment for future mitigation and response. And one thing about the survey that was used for this report is it was completed earlier in 2020. And so I'm sure that number has moved up since then from 50%, and it's got to be closer to 100% at this point. But you can see other things like performance-based contracts, dual sources of supply, requiring your suppliers to have alternate sites. All of those can be part of the mitigation plan for risk identified in your supplier base. So the Apex portal really, the risk module does a really nice job of pulling together all of the different sorts of mitigation tactics that you might have in place. Not only mitigation, but risk assessment activities. So for every supplier, there's an overall composite risk score that's made up of several different things. One is active news monitoring of the global news, and news is filtered using IBM Watson's natural language processing to identify financial risk, operational, geographic, reputational and regulatory risk that is identified in news, and scores all of those articles and then gives you drill down to the risk scores that are to the high risk news items that are related to your supplier. Up at the top right is fraud risk, and Joni's been using this solution for many, many years. It just is a composite scoring model that looks at supplier attributes and transaction attributes to identify suspicious activity and flag up a supplier that might require some more scrutiny. And then at the bottom right is a questionnaire facility that allows you to ask targeted questions based on the supplier risks presented by the supplier type, the supplier spend, et cetera. And so it can be a data security questionnaire for IT vendors, conflict minerals for manufacturing vendors, child labor policies, any sorts of questions you might ask. You can create a customized questionnaire. The supplier can fill these out during their onboarding process or on a regularly scheduled basis, say an annual basis, or when some event triggers further scrutiny around a given supplier. And then you can track the remediation activity right here in the solution. One thing that we didn't talk about that's often part of these programs is monitoring supplier performance. And if a supplier's performance degrades over time, then they're obviously presenting supplier risk. So we've got some pre-built supplier performance questionnaires. These can be totally customized, and companies are using performance as part of their risk mitigation effort just to make sure that they stay on top of any risk issues that are out there, and to make sure that contracts are being complied with. Let's see. So, Joni, I'll pose this question to you. To start a supplier risk management program, what would you do before spending $1 on risk management software?
Well, a lesson learned in my past days here is that you do need to collaborate with people in the business. So you need to be across different areas to make sure there's not already something in place that they have. An example was we did have a risk group that had their own solution for kind of onboarding suppliers, which I had no idea they were doing. And in fact, they weren't really using it the way it was designed to be used. And then they found out we had a supplier portal that had a built-in risk questionnaire in there. So making sure that you're aligned is key, and that everybody understands what this was going to be used for and how it works, especially in these big organizations. Even in smaller ones, it's critical that everybody knows how this works, what the objective is, and let's not sign up, work in silos, and do our own thing, because it just gets too convoluted.
Yeah, it's just really common for companies, maybe a group that's managing diversity, to go out and try and find a supplier onboarding and management tool. And then the sustainability team does that, risk management does that, IT risk management does that, and then AP or procurement has their own. Everything works better if all of this is together in one place, and you can really save a lot of money and implementation and headaches if you get a best-in-class solution to do all of it. And another thing I do is look back a couple of years and see how everything has changed, and just get a feel for how much everything has changed, and then think about the next 5 to 10 years and how everything is likely to change again. I mean, everything changed in the past year, and then when the economy opens back up for everyone and everyone feels comfortable, it's about to change again, and 2 or 3 years from now it will change again. So it's really important that whatever you implement to manage risk is flexible enough to address changes over time. You don't want to just have somebody build something that is going to be hard to maintain over time. Lots of IT driven solutions that are built by your internal IT department from scratch often don't have that sort of flexibility that is necessary. So just make sure whatever you implement is going to have the flexibility for you to change it as risks change over time. So with that, I don't know, Joni, do you have anything else you want to say before we move on to Q&A?
I was just going to throw in there one example of something that happened to us over this past year, and I'm sure it happened to a lot of companies, was being able to get supplies that you needed from your suppliers that you were using, but everybody was asking for those same supplies. So for us, we needed the gloves, the wipes to clean down things on the airplane. That was a huge problem because they ran out and we only had certain suppliers set up for that. So it's just one thing to learn from going forward. Make sure that you have a backup plan there for all different kinds of conditions. Obviously, I hope we don't ever have to go through another pandemic, but this was a big lesson for us to learn.
Yeah, so people were having to onboard suppliers really quickly, and they just needed a way that they can do that without compromising controls. Fraudsters were taking advantage of those poor controls during hurried supplier onboarding processes this year, and people who had automated controls could onboard faster than those who didn't.
Right, and there's also those suppliers kind of taking advantage, maybe a little bit of the cost on that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, good. Well, thanks, Joni. We're just really excited about any questions that you may have in the audience today. So please enter those questions in the chat box in WebEx. And also, you should be seeing a poll. If this is really just a way for you to request more information if you're interested in anything from the Gartner, a copy of the Gartner report, to more information about onboarding, cleansing, working capital, recovery audits, which Joni talked about, duplicates, and then a final white paper we have about audit. But any questions you have for Joni or for me, please enter them in the chat box. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matthew Marukian, my colleague here, to raise any questions that have come in so far.
Yeah, so we have a couple questions. Danny, you mentioned bank account ownership, and someone was asking if you could provide a little bit more details on what that is.
Yeah, so historically, people have used things like callbacks or emails back to the known contact at the supplier to validate that a bank account change request is authentic. Or maybe they ran a penny test. But what we learned in the last year with a huge rise of business email compromise, where fraudsters would take over a supplier's email account, or also in the case where people were working from home, maybe the contact data, the phone number that you had for the supplier contact, they weren't answering their desk phone. And then there's always the risk of internal fraud. So one of our clients brought to us an idea that we then implemented into the supplier portal, working with a consortium of banks that I think it's something like 2,500 banking institutions. Our data are reflected in this database. And if you through our portal, we pass the legal name, tax ID, entity type, and bank account to this validation service with this consortium of banks. And they let us know, is that the right legal name of the authorized signer for the account, of the company or the authorized signer of the account? So that way we get back a message if there's a mismatch between the supplier's information and the bank account that your payables are going to go to. And if that validation fails, then you've got something you got to dig into. It might, the account might still be valid if maybe the supplier didn't provide their legal name. So you might need to go back to the supplier and get the actual legal name, or maybe it's truly a fraudster. Either way, to follow up before the bank account change hits your ERP and you start making payments. And so that's working in the US. We have that account name validation in Sweden and India. And then we have other pretty deep controls around bank account validations in the rest of the world.
Thank you, Danny. Here's another question. And here, second. Are you able to utilize the Apex portal as a central repository for data from various other risk platforms or other platforms in general?
Yeah, absolutely. So I showed that dashboard. I'll just go back to that. This dashboard, as well as any questionnaires or any scores that are involved in the dashboard, can be sourced with questionnaires inside the Apex portal that are presented to the supplier in the portal, or that are fed from your own ERP systems or other P2P solutions. Or if you're using another risk management source, like maybe D&B or risk methods or rapid ratings, scores out of those systems can be fed into this scoring module, as well as just whole PDFs of risk reports coming out of those solutions can be presented inside the solution as well. So we have clients that are doing all of that and consolidating all of the risk information right here in the Apex Portal Risk module.
So I have a question for both you and Joni. On one of the slides, there was the percentages of people with risk management programs, yes, no, and limited. And there's 23% with no. Is there, maybe there's just not a priority within the organization? Is there any projects that you think that if you were in their shoes, you'd prioritize to show the value of risk management? Are there any projects or tactics that you'd start with? Danny, I'll give it to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the ones I would start looking at are collect information about fraud attempts over the previous year. I would look at any supply chain disruption type information that has occurred over the past year. Those are the ones that just come immediately to mind for me. How about you, Joni?
You know, when I started looking at this, the one thing that I did was I ran a sample. So I provided some sample data to get some type of insight and some feedback as to what we look like. That was my biggest selling point for the software, actually, was to show that what it provided and what it could do. And there were, even though it was a small data sample, I think it was 3 months, there was quite a bit in there.
Yeah, so one thing that's pretty easy for us to do, because you don't have to do a full portal deployment to get it, is in the solution that powers this news scoring is built into our Smart VM solution, which is available online. It doesn't even have to be integrated with your ERP system. And you can upload vendor records, vendor names and addresses, and run these scores in real time and drill down into the news. So that's a pretty interesting way to get a quick risk assessment just based on the news that's out there in the world about suppliers.
And Danny, for bank account, if someone didn't have, they wanted to deploy a bank account validation quickly rather than going through integration, how could you do that with Apex?
Yeah, it's a great question. Very similarly, the bank account ownership validation can be run as part of our Smart VM solution, again, where you upload data into that solution and then you get the results back in real time. So that solution really helps you do, if you want to do a scrub of your vendors, maybe as a one-time, and then as new suppliers come on board or you get new information, you can go back in and just re-scrub subsets as you need. You can also set up continuous monitoring so that you get any updates associated with existing suppliers throughout the year as you schedule it.
So here's another question, and if anyone has any additional questions, please ask. They have limited resources. Which supplier categories or characteristics should they focus on when looking at all their suppliers? So are there any supplier categories that they should start with trying to roll out a risk management program?
Well, I mean, IT suppliers are really popular suppliers to start with because of data security risks. Those have traditionally been concerns. Um, and there's Gartner actually has a methodology where you go through and you assess the risk of your suppliers and typically start with high spend, high volume suppliers that are critical to your supply chain. So, that's another category you can look at. Joni, do you have any others?
Yeah, I was going to say IT for sure. Definitely different requirements around your IT supplier. So that's a really good place to start. Um, for us, it's the dollar, how much.
Mhm.
So it's kind of, it depends on your organization and what you look at as your risk.
Yeah, one risk group in another industry in healthcare is anyone that's coming on site to a healthcare facility. You've got to make sure they know and have agreed to and are complying with your health information protection rules. They need to make sure that any personally identifiable information, particularly related to your patient's health, is protected. So that's one area we see healthcare companies focusing on.
Right.
So a person sent in a question, and it could be answered a couple different ways, but they're basically asking with data validation, does it prove something definitive, or does it really just point out that a specialist needs to further investigate? And I know that can be dependent upon what type of data you're validating. So bank account could be different than tax ID or address. But Danny, could you speak to some of the data points that prove a conclusive yes, no, or flag, and then maybe some others that are may require investigation?
Yeah, so some examples would be is it a prison? Does your supplier have a prison address? Now, in almost every case, if you have a supplier that has a prison address, there's something suspicious going on. But there is a chance, there are sometimes services that are run out of prisons, like, in marketing, there are groups that schedule meetings, attempt to schedule meetings for people, and they work out of prisons. But it'd be very unusual, and if that flags up, then you pretty well know you've got a problem. Um, then there are examples like I think Joni mentioned sequential invoice numbers are super suspicious. Um, Invoice numbers that are out of sequence are suspicious as well. And then home addresses, is the address in a residential neighborhood. Those could go either way, and spend is a really key factor. If you've got $20 million of spend going to an address that's in a residential neighborhood, that probably means you've got some insider fraud going on. Um, so those are different sorts of examples. And then when it comes to risk questionnaires, those are really there are two sorts of scenarios with risk questionnaires. One is sometimes you need a supplier to affirmatively say, yes, I'm going to comply with all of these rules. And if they say no to any of them, then they shouldn't be your supplier. But sometimes if they say no, it's okay as long as a mitigating plan is in place and they're going to come into compliance within in an agreed period of time. So that's an example of maybe it's not a definite yes/no decision just based on a given score. Another example is OFAC list matching. It's just really common for multiple people to have the same name. And so someone may pop on the OFAC list that is actually an upstanding citizen. And so, some further investigation is required in those cases. Joni, do you have any other examples?
One thing that we do is we look at the relation between our employees and vendors. So if they have a matching address, phone number, we would obviously want to see that, especially a bank account. That would be critical. Also, if you're doing business, $20 million with somebody that only has one cell phone, I would take a deeper look at that if that's their only contact. Or at a PO box, a mail stop, something like that. That would flag that we would definitely investigate that further. And government risk around government contracts, any type of government employee, are you asking the right questions around that to satisfy your own internal rules for that? For us, it's very strict. I know a lot of big companies obviously have those same rules. You would want to make sure that you're in compliance there as well.
Yeah, that just reminds me, politically exposed persons lists, those that data is built into the portal. If you subscribe to the Smart VM database, it taps all of the world's government employees. And so that way, using that information and the beneficial owner of different supplier organizations that you're paying, if you bump those lists together, then you can identify potential risks for bribery.
So we talked a little bit about diverse suppliers, and Joni, you were just mentioning compliance potentially with spend. And Danny, it'd be good if you just talked about how portal can be leveraged to identify and validate diverse suppliers, and how it could support compliance, but then also any diversity initiatives your company may have.
Sure. There's several ways. The most basic is, as a supplier is registering, you could just ask them if they are meet the requirements for any of the major diversity categories. But it's one thing for a supplier to say that they're diverse. Companies often need to confirm that they qualify, and because you as a company may have a diversity initiative and may publish your diversity statistics, but if an auditor or somehow the press found out that you were claiming a large amount of spend as diverse that maybe really wasn't, it could be embarrassing for you as a company. So it's important to validate that the supplier is actually registered either with the Small Business Administration or one of the other organizations, either in the US or around the world, that are considered the definitive sources of diversity information. And then also, one of the things that we've seen companies do is, as they're going live on the portal, they do a quick check of all of their existing suppliers and find one client that deployed this tells a story that they found about $2.5 million of additional diversity spend in their existing spend that they weren't that wasn't previously identified. So that's another thing you can do. And then two more, just searching for suppliers who are diverse. If you're looking to identify opportunities for more diversity spend, you can use our Smart VM database or our discovery module to search for suppliers who are diverse, and then invite them into the normal onboarding process so that you can use them in the future. Or maybe you could feed those suppliers into your sourcing solution for potential use at a later date. And then the last one, of course, is risk management and performance management. Lots of companies, as part of their diversity programs, identify diverse suppliers and then put them in a specialized program to help them become more and more effective suppliers. Sometimes it's easier to take a diverse supplier that you're doing business with and grow your business with them rather than go and identify another one. And if you can get their performance to be even better and better and better, then of course you're going to do more and more business with them.
So someone asked a question about what type of information could be validated for a small private supplier. And I think they were thinking that risk management would be more oriented for a larger company. But I guess, you know, you could speak to just how Apex Portal is supporting and managing smaller companies. And I guess, Joni, is that a focus of the Apex Portal for you in managing all those smaller suppliers?
Yeah.
Maybe...
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we do have some that are smaller suppliers. Again, it would be a red flag to me if we were their only customer on some of these smaller suppliers, and that's just mainly because of it depends on what they're providing as a service. So, for example, if there's some type of aircraft repair service that we use and we are their only customer, and I'm giving you this example because this was a true example that we found. We were their only customer, and it was a red flag for sure. While we couldn't really prove that they weren't doing some of these services, what we did find is an extreme overcharge for the services. And those are things that you'd want to watch out for. I'm not saying all small businesses are like that. It's just depending on your industry, really, how you're using these suppliers. And then just one other thing that Danny mentioned on the diversity piece, they upload their certificates directly into the portal. So it's always there. If there were to be an audit, you have that in there. So just wanted to let you know that, because that was key for us to have that repository with all of their information there.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, you can set up schedules to recertify suppliers if you want to, because sometimes a company that is diverse today might not be a diverse company tomorrow, and vice versa. And typically what happens with companies that are monitoring, they set some levels of checks that apply to every supplier, regardless of size and spend, because just there's certain level of controls that can be fully automated, as well as are just really important. We've talked about bank account quite a bit today. The fraud risk monitoring is easily run across all spend, and really you're looking for fraud in those cases most likely. And then with suppliers that meet the thresholds that you have, where you really want to more actively monitor them, but you can't find external data sources to get the scoring that you need, they might not appear in the news that often. That's where the questionnaire process comes in. You ask suppliers to complete questionnaires. You may ask internal users to fill out questionnaires associated with your suppliers as well. Just, are they performing, and are you seeing any red flags associated with them? So, that's the way I would approach a private organization that's smaller.
Thank you. So that is the end of our questions. If anyone on the webinar has any questions afterwards, just send us an email. Joni is on webinars constantly. We always trick her into participating, and we talked about risk today, but she talks more about some of the solutions like First Strike that she uses on other webinars. So go on our webinar section, and you can listen to Joni speak about some other things she's doing at JetBlue. I think that is it. Danny and Joni, thank you for participating. Everyone on the call or on the webinar, you'll get a copy of this video, and you can share with any of your colleagues probably by tomorrow. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, Joni.
Thank you, guys.